Friends, I have another guest speaker for you to introduce, and that is Dr. Tim Hobbs. It's my pleasure to introduce you to Dr. Tim Hobbs, CEO of Dartington Service Design Lab in the UK. This is actually Tim's second visit and presentation at an FRSA conference, and we're delighted that he's joining us again. The Dartington Service Design Lab works with numerous public systems, charities and foundations to help shape a series of bold investments, experiments designed to improve child outcomes in the UK and internationally. When we first approached him to speak at the conference, the Institute had recently completed a body of work, Matching Children's Needs and Services, a case of 3 circles, drawing on a decade of experience of mapping need and charting the use of services by people. Data from over 38,000 children and families was analysed to answer 2 fundamental questions. How much need is there in the population, and do services meet those needs? They seem simple questions, but there is a tough and very complex answer. In the context of the review of programs that focused on children, families and communities at the federal level, as well as ongoing children, families and communities, budgetary pressures around the services we provide, we asked him to come and share with us the learnings from this project. They will be relevant, and we will be able to use that information to apply to not only our local context, but more broadly at a national level. Tim makes conversations about data accessible, understandable, and believe it or not, fun. It's actually true. In Tim's workshop yesterday, I can confirm that Mr. Potato Head was an essential workshopping tool. And 25 years ago when I entered this sector, if I had known that that's what it took to gain the undivided attention of a large group of people to talk about social change, I would have made the investment at Toys R Us then and there. We might hear a little more about that later on. Tim started with the Dartington Service Design Lab as a researcher in 2004, and 15 years later, he now leads the organisation. He holds a first-class Bachelor of Science in Psychology and Criminology, a PhD in Social and Policy Science, and a recipient of the Kammerman and Kahn Award for the International Society of Child Indicators, and a 2016 Claw Social Fellow. Please join me in welcoming Tim to the stage.
Great, thanks ever so much for that introduction, very kind introduction. I'd also just like to extend my gratitude for the wonderful welcome that we had from the traditional owners and custodians of this land. And I'd also like to thank Michael for his amazing, challenging talk, which I think sets the scene really, really well. I feel slightly conflicted in that I am a white, privileged individual working for a privileged organisation. However, one thing that I really took from Michael's talk was the number that I'm representing. And you're going to hear a little bit more about it. I'm not going to tell you what the number is, because I'm doing a quiz, and I'm going to be asking you what the number is. But the number that I'm representing here is the proportion of vulnerable children and young people that exist in every community, and thinking about what we can do to improve outcomes for communities that we're working within. So, let me just see how the slides work here. Let me tell you a little bit about the Dartington Service Design Lab, an independent research charity that's been around in one form or another for over 50 odd years. Started life at King's College in Cambridge, where we were doing research around progressive forms of education for vulnerable children. And really over the last 50 years, the consistent focus of the work has been the practical application of data and research to improve policy and practice for children and young people. And there's a real emphasis there on the practical application bit. We're trained as researchers, as scientists, yet the majority of our team are frustrated scientists and academics who've left universities to come and work in the real world, working with local governments, with communities, with providers of services for children and families. And so we really like rolling our sleeves up and trying to apply that research, data and evidence to improve lives of children and young people. We've had a bit of a journey ourselves as an organisation. We used to be pretty kind of top-down on the research and the evidence side of things. We used to work squarely in that pink corner of this diagram here, where the evidence and the data was. And we worked hard at synthesizing what we know about how to improve outcomes for kids. We synthesized evidence around needs and data, and we synthesized evidence around effective practice that has been shown by randomized controlled trials and other methodologies to improve outcomes for kids. And for many years, we kind of imposed down on communities, on policymakers, on practitioners. We imposed that evidence and said, just use this, it's gonna help. But what we've really kind of learnt over the years, and certainly where we're taking things in a very strong direction now, is that evidence and data and research is not neutral, it's not biased, it's a product of the questions and the privilege that we ask as organisations. And for evidence to be useful, it needs to be really grounded in the context, the realities of the communities that we're working with and the people that we are serving. So a lot of our work now is trying to balance and work at those intersections between evidence and research, but by the people that are ultimately going to be using or benefiting or receiving from these services, or those practitioners that are delivering it. So we're working at those intersections between evidence and the people using that information. And we're also doing a lot of work where traditionally our work focused quite narrowly on individual services and practices, on the services that you're providing. And that's really important, because that's where the rub is. You as practitioners, when you're working with families, the interactions that you're having with families is the rub. That's where you can make an impact to the lives of children and families. So we don't want to lose sight of that focus on services, but we must also acknowledge that services are nested, they're part of broader systems, and those systems might be communities, they might be public agencies, they might come together in different ways. But if you're not designing intentionally with systems in mind, or you're not aware of those biases and the things the dynamics that Mike was describing within systems that can sweep away the best intentions, you're going to struggle to have a limited impact as well. So we do a lot of work thinking around the intersections between services and systems as well. And we think that by situating data and evidence somewhere in the middle, that's where you're going to have a likely greater impact and use. So that's kind of where we're working in as an organisation. So what we're talking about today is first of all a challenge, an empirical case study from the UK that is exploring how well services are meeting the needs of populations of children and families. We're going to look at some possible responses, some ways that we as a sector might go around responding to those challenges. We're going to look at some sort of current limitations in our analytical toolboxes, and we're going to think about how we might respond and what the future might look like. So I'm going to say something about big data, which might sound scary. I'm also going to say something about thick data, which doesn't mean stupid data, by the way. It's the opposite. Right, but first of all, I'm going to ask you a few kind of quiz questions in just a minute, but just to get you kind of warmed up and practicing this. If any of you have a smartphone, an iPad, a tablet, a laptop, anything that's connected to the internet, if you go to that website, Slido, just Google Slido, and you'll be asked to enter in a number, a code. There's already a hashtag put in there already, so just enter B049, and that will take you to a question. So first of all, I just want to know who's in the room. So if with the AV, if we could flick to the first question. So what is your primary role? Are you a practitioner? Are you a service manager? Are you a executive? Are you a local policymaker? I learned yesterday that no one knows what a commissioner is. That means funder in the UK. Are you a federal policymaker? So log on to Slido, put in that number, and cast your vote, and we'll start seeing responses as you enter them in there. And there may possibly be an option to scroll down, AV guy. I'm not sure if that's all the responses or whether there's more. We'll see. Okay, the results are coming in. The service managers are storming ahead at 50%. Oh, resurgence from the federal policymakers, catching up. Oh, yeah, okay, there's so far no lawyers, no others. Oh, there is another. Who are you, other? Okay, I'll just give you a minute or two just to get the hang of it, cast any kind of final votes. Okay. Well, this is a wonderful audience that you have. We said at the beginning that the FRSA is bringing together practitioners and leadership across the children and family services market place. And I think what we can see here is that we've got a very strong representation for practitioners and managers of services and those that are running organisations providing services. That's by far the strongest representation here in the room. And then we've also got some policymakers and funders of services. And some mysterious others too. We don't have time to find out who you are. Okay, so I'll close time on this voting, but keep your smartphones at the ready because you'll need them in just a minute. So if we can go back to the slides, please. So, the challenge. We often get asked at Dartington in the UK by central government, by local government, by trust foundations and philanthropy, to come into a place and help design strategies to improve outcomes for children and young people, to help them spend their money, their existing money, and how they might tailor and shift that money, as well as support the resources that exist in those communities to improve outcomes for kids. And the first thing that we want to know typically is, well, how are children and families doing in the area that you're working in? What are their health and development like? In which areas are children and families thriving? And in which areas might they be struggling within? And when we ask that question, it's really hard to get a good answer. What we see over and over again is that we know quite a lot about children and families that are already known to services and public systems. We know quite a lot about the needs of young people known to social services, to mental health systems. We know quite a lot about those known within the health system and those with difficulties. And that information, that biases a lot of our thinking around the needs of a population. What we don't know very much about is the needs of the wider population. What about the needs and well-being of children and families who are not known to existing services and systems? We have some data from our National Health Service in the UK, which has aspects of universal provision. We have some information from education systems. But again, those data are reasonably kind of patchy. They just tell us a little bit. To try and work against that challenge, we then started going out and collecting new data on the needs of all children and young people within communities. We started doing this work in Scotland, in the UK, partly because Scotland's pretty progressive in terms of its social policy for children and young people, and it's also quite progressive in its ability to link together existing data. And it's also small enough that everyone knows everyone, so we can get work done in Scotland. So we went out and we collected new data. We worked in three what are called local authorities, 3 local jurisdictions in Scotland. We asked children in schools to complete some online surveys that measured their health, development and well-being using a whole bunch of standardized, validated kind of tools and measures. And of all children of the eligible age ranges in those schools, over 90% of children were taking part in these surveys. So we've got data here from 22,000 kids. So it's a pretty good kind of response rate here. And if anything, the data that I'm going to show you represents a conservative picture of need. Because of course there's 10% of kids that we didn't hear from directly, either because they weren't in school that day, they were sick or poorly, or because they were out of school. They were, I don't know what you call it here, skiving, mitching, I don't know what it's called. But so if anything, the data that I'm going to share with you is a conservative estimate of need. We also gather data from 16,000 parents or carers of children within the community via some community-based sampling approaches. But then the really neat thing, if I don't say so myself, is that we then linked data. And this is really important. We measured the well-being of all children, or almost all children and young people within those communities, but we also then were able to, because of the neat data systems in Scotland, we were able to link their data and well-being to also understand whether they were in receipt of services, targeted services from social care, from mental health, from special education, or other targeted services. So we were able to explore both the needs of a population and the extent to which children and young people were receiving support. So, get your smartphones at the ready. This grey circle here, this represents all children and young people in a community. And through the work that we did, we asked, we were able to identify the proportion of the population that had high levels of need. And this is kind of broadly defined as children who are experiencing impairments or difficulties or risks to their health and development, that if they were to see a psychiatrist or a social worker or a clinician, they would meet some threshold, either a diagnosis or a threshold that would mean that they would be eligible for some targeted, more intensive support services. There's lots to that definition, but basically what I'm asking you here is, what proportion of kids in a population do you think have high levels of need? So if you go to Slido, the question should be there. If we could flip to the question screen, let's see how the votes are coming in. Okay, so a small proportion of you, 5% or so, are really kind of punching high, thinking it's above 50%. Looks like the majority of responses are coming in. 50% of you think it's somewhere between 25 and 40%. There's a few of you down there being sort of a bit conservative, thinking around the 21 to 25%. Let's go up to the top. Oh, yes. Okay, so yeah, this almost 10% of you think it's over 51%. Okay. All right. We'll call the voting a day on that one. The votes go for you're predominantly in the kind of 30 to 40% range. So let's go back to the slides and we'll see what the answer is. You are a pessimistic lot. You are. The response is 23%. So what we found was that over 1 in 5, almost 1 in 4 children have high levels of need within a community. Now that's a pretty scary picture. That is all children and young people in these given communities had high levels of need, and these were fairly typical jurisdictions in Scotland that represented pockets of both kind of dense urban towns as well as quite rural areas. I should also say that we've undertaken this work in countless places across the UK and the world. We've done it in over 30 local jurisdictions in the UK now, in England and Scotland. We've done it in Spain, we've done it in the Republic of Ireland, we've done it in Providence in Rhode Island, we've done it in a couple of other places in the States. And what we find is that this picture is remarkably consistent. We have not done the work here in Scotland, but I'd be or here in Australia, but I'd be pretty confident that the figure is going to be broadly within this range if we were to do it. Typically, it ranges somewhere from 18 to 25, 26% is the typical range. So that's scary. That's a big deal. That's a high level of need. So, Michael, that's my number. 23% is the number that I'm representing, which is the proportion of children and young people that are vulnerable in our communities that we can do better by. So next question. What proportion of the population do we provide sort of high-end services to? So I'm not asking you which proportion of those with high levels of need, but which proportion of the whole population do you think receive high-end services? So these are not your universal services, but these are targeted services for children and families with identified sort of high levels of need. So, social work provision, mental health support. An important caveat to bear in mind when you're voting here is that it also includes special educational needs support in schools. So additional support within schools for identified needs. Spoiler alert, that ups the figure quite a bit. So what proportion of the population do you think have high levels of need? Let's take a look at the voting. Let's see where you're going to. Okay. So, a smattering of votes at the kind of real high end. It looks like, scrolling down, that the majority of votes are falling pretty squarely within the 6 to 10% range, or the 11 to 15% range. Let's give you a minute or two to cast any final votes. I don't think the picture's going to change much. Okay, all right, 6 to 10% is the winner, with 11 to 15 in second place. Okay, let's go back to the slides and see what the response is. A bit closer this time. The response is 12%. So you were pretty close on that one. Typical Western jurisdictions typically provide targeted intensive services to about 1 in 10 kids. If we took out special educational needs provision in schools, that goes right down to near 4 or 5%. And again, we've done this in countless places, and we find broadly the same picture. The size of the circle varies slightly, place by place, but it's broadly within the ballpark. So, next question. What's the overlap between the proportion of children and young people with high levels of needs and the services that they receive? Is it a perfect overlap in that every person who is receiving services is also high levels of need? Or is it a poor, an absolutely crap overlap where no one in high need is receiving services and vice versa? So again, let's just go back to the voting. I'm going to speed up a little bit now, so I'm not going to give you long to vote on this one. But let's take a look at the voting. So you can either vote, if you're voting 10 stars, that means you think there's a very, very good overlap. If you're voting kind of lower down, you think it's a bad overlap. Okay, so most of you are, on average, you're leaning to not terrible, but it's on the kind of poorer side of an overlap than the good. Okay, let's go back to the slides, and I'll reveal for the final time. So this is what the picture looks like. Bear with me. There we go. That's the overlap. So typically, about half of those in receipt of targeted services have high levels of need. Now this is another scary, challenging picture, particularly to a service practitioner audience. What does it say? It says that there are high levels of need within communities. Your services, the reach of your services, do not have capacity to meet that level of need. Even if the alignment was perfect, you wouldn't be getting anywhere near meeting the levels of need that exist within your populations. And what's more, there are a number of people, children and families, who are in receipt of services who actually don't have high levels of need now. There are children and young people on your caseloads who aren't those in the greatest need. And there are a whole bunch of other kids out there that could do better. Now, of course, that's a challenging, sort of provocative statement, and we explored and digged into this quite a lot. There are a few good reasons why the overlap isn't as high as you might expect. One is that actually there's a whole bunch of children who are in receipt of targeted services, not because they've got any difficulties with their own well-being or development, but because there are heightened levels of risk to those families. So that represents a good proportion of that misalignment. There are also, optimistically, some would say that maybe those children and young people, this is a snapshot in time. So maybe those children and young people did have high levels of need, but actually services have done a great job. They've improved the outcomes of those kids, but they're still on the books. So there's a bit of an overlap there. And so we did a whole bunch of audit, case file analysis to really kind of dig into this. And that's broadly kind of borne out. But nonetheless, it's still true that there are a bunch of children and families that you're serving whose needs aren't high. So this is a challenging situation. So what can you do about it? So one potential scenario is that you could increase the reach of your services, hypothetically. Let's see if this is going to work. So you could expand reach of services. But you will know that is probably not a viable option in the UK. We've had about 5 years of severe austerity cuts to public services. Local jurisdictions, children's services, budgets have been cut by about a third in the UK. So we're not seeing any increase in services. I don't think this is bleak here, at least not now. But you almost certainly do not have the funding to demonstrably massively increase your reach. So you could invest in prevention. You could try and shrink the size of that red circle by investing more in public health, universal and preventative approaches to try and improve the health, development and well-being of children and families in communities. And we think that's a pretty good idea. And of course, you could try to better align your services. You could try and more tightly tailor the provision of your precious limited resources to those with the greatest level of need. And of course, doing that in conjunction with a prevention approach is, again, a pretty kind of viable option. So, how are you going to do that? And this is kind of where data comes in. So what I've hoped to sort of present to you here is that data could be your friend. Data could be a powerful tool to help you advocate for changes that you want to make. It can help you advocate for greater investments in prevention, early intervention, and greater investment in the services that you're providing so they can be more effectively targeted to the needs of families. But we need to get smarter in how we're using data. So, we think it's really important. In order to get smarter at targeting our services, we need to get much better at segmenting the needs of a population. So what we mean by that is, I just showed you a big pink circle of high levels of need. But of course, within that, there are all sorts of interesting patterns, trends, and drivers that are contributing to those needs within the population. And by having good quality data, like we've gone out and collected, you can begin to understand and explore those patterns, identify relationships, and identify groups. You can then create kind of data-informed, I've written data-driven, I don't mean data-driven, data-informed groupings of different needs. What you'll see is there are often clusters of need that will exist both in populations, but also within your service level populations as well. There are groups of children and families that broadly cluster with discrete sets of needs. And it follows that you can then create personas, different broad representations of those different groups. And once you know what those groupings are, you can get much smarter about aligning your services and your activities to meet those specific needs, segments, or profiles of need that exist within your population. So the workshop we were doing yesterday, we spent a fair bit of time talking about theories of change. But what that means is that when you can then be really smart about tailoring and focusing your services on discrete subgroups and populations of need. And this can inform either preventative efforts, or it can inform efforts that are sort of more direct work with children and families with existing levels of need. And then the real trick to doing this well, the real trick to making a dent in that 23%, is then coordinating, aligned as a system working together. And you can do that. Many of you represent large organizations that are working across Australia or different states. You can be much smarter in tailoring and segmenting your different services and aligning them. You can also work together much more effectively as a sector, saying, okay, we're going to work with this group of needs, this cohort. We're not going to do that because that's your bag, that's what you're doing. But let's align and be smarter about how we're deploying your precious resources. So that's all good. It's easy to kind of talk that talk, and we've been able to kind of dig into this because we've gone out and collected these kind of new data that exist. And we did that because existing data sets weren't at our fingertips. However, that is changing now. We are moving to a point where there is increasingly becoming better data that's available to us that we can harness. And I think Barry's probably going to talk about some of the potential around this after the break. But big data is really the analysis of large data sets. And we're talking here large data sets. We had data on 22,000 kids. That's pretty small in the world of big data. We're talking here about like sort of hundreds of thousands, millions of kind of data points that come together. And we can then use a whole bunch of like fancy analytical techniques that are often referred to as machine learning or AI. But essentially, those are kind of algorithms that are deployed that identify patterns, and they learn themselves. They learn to get smarter at identifying patterns and trends in such a way that our teeny tiny human minds can't possibly comprehend. And there are some really kind of exciting developments that are happening in this big data space. Big data can provide insights into behaviors which can be used to inform the targeting and delivery of services. Now, we don't do this as a sector, but every other industry almost is doing this, and they're doing it really bloody well. Netflix, for example, or Amazon Prime, or whatever you're looking at there, they're driven by big data analytics. 80% of what you watch on Netflix is driven by the big data algorithms that are driving and pushing content to you, because they've created a persona about you. They know a lot about you and your needs, your likes, your dislikes. They've created clusters, and they're targeting their services to you. Food delivery companies, Deliveroo, or the many other ones that will operate here, they also have incredibly smart, sophisticated algorithms that know an awful lot about you, and that means that they can work with restaurants and providers to make sure that you get the food at the right time, so it's ready, so it gets you hotter and quicker, and so on. So industry is getting really smart at this, and it's kind of scary, and there's some problems with it, which I'll touch upon in a sec. But if industries are doing this, why aren't we doing this in children's services? You know, what we care about is not profit, it's impact on outcomes for vulnerable children and families. And I'd argue that we can and should be using and harnessing some of this analytical capability to better tailor, target, segment, understand the needs of our population, and be much smarter and strategic around how we're doing this. I said there are some reservations around this. The reason it's not here right now is because some of the data is a bit patchy. We're getting better at linking it up. Government agencies are beginning to open up. But there are many biases in the data, and actually there are some structural kind of biases that are written into many algorithms. We need to be really careful that we're not perpetuating bias that exists, be that racial, ethnic biases, gender biases. There are all sorts of biases that are implicitly written into these algorithms, and we need to get much smarter at wheedling out that bias. And of course, there are information governance and privacy concerns. People are naturally skeptical about sharing their data. Families are skeptical about it. Agencies are skeptical about it. But those are all technical challenges that with trust with communities can be developed and overcome. But right now, it's emerging, it's coming your way. But in the meantime, what do you do? And this is where thick data comes in. So big data is insights from loads and loads, hundreds of thousands, millions of data points. Thick data are insights from, driven from practice experience and practice wisdom. And you hold so much of this data in your heads right now. Thick data came around, there's a woman called Tricia Wang who was working at Nokia, which a decade ago was the largest mobile phone company in the world. And they were generally providing expensive, high-end mobile phones to customers. Tricia was out in the field doing ethnographic work, talking to families in rural China and internet cafes in towns and cities all over the place. And she picked up from her deep, qualitative practice wisdom of working with families that there was an increasing appetite and trend for people on lower incomes to spend more on a mid-range product. And she took this back to the board at Nokia, and they said, well, our big data doesn't support that. Our big data is promoting this growth towards high-end products, just like Apple and others are doing. So we're gonna follow that that trough. And now Nokia has all but collapsed. Their big data wasn't sophisticated enough to pick up the trends. And actually, those practice insights that Tricia held were absolutely on the money about understanding the needs. So thick data, which in this context is really about practice wisdom, is critical. Thick data is qualitative insights, deep learning gained from ethnography and your practice wisdom. And it's a lot about context. And you know your context far better than an algorithm ever can. So my kind of concluding comments then really are that I think the future of data analytics here in Children and Family Services is the bringing together of big data, analytical capabilities, and all of the opportunity that can bring through data linkage, through data sharing, through smart segmentation of needs. But it's not that on its own, it's that big data coupled with the thick data, the practice wisdom that you hold, that rests and resides within your teams and within your local data systems. And by bringing those two perspectives together, that's where I think you can get really smart around using data, and we might start making a dent in that 23%. So thank you. I'll close there, and I think we'll have questions after the break, right? Okay. Time for at least 3 questions, all right.
My name's Bill. I work in the community sector in Canberra. One thing that we're actually coming across is the fear of data. Careful what you ask for because you might get it. And then the governments, in some case, we put pressure on them to respond. And they sometimes then say, but we don't have the finance to respond. So you end up with these data asking lots of questions that people are very unwilling to solve.
Yeah, sure. So I think the context in which many of us are working at the moment is we are awash with data. There's actually too much data. You're asked for too much data, and the majority of your asks as a service are typically for accountability purposes from government and from those that are funding. Now, of course, accountability is really important. We need to be held accountable for the precious public money that gets spent on what we're doing. We want to be accountable. However, accountability does have a tendency to drive up the provision of too much data. And if the sole purpose is accountability, then what we tend to see is increased kind of gaming of data. And then people lose trust in the data. They collect too much data and it's not used for you as practitioners and service providers. And so we've certainly experienced that in the UK over the last decade, but what we're seeing increasingly now is the smarter use of, the smarter asking of data, and increasingly funders, commissioners and policymakers asking for what's referred to as minimally sufficient data. So they'll only ask you for the data that is absolutely essential for those reporting requirements. And that's been a very welcome trend in the UK. I think you're probably earlier on in that journey here in Australia, but there is an international trend towards that. So hold tight, it will probably get easier. I think a second important shift is an increasing shift from accountability or proving towards from proving to improving. So data is most valuable if it's data for you. If it's data that can help you do your work better. If you can use that data to work within your teams, within your supervision arrangements. So if the data's working for you, then you'll get a lot more kind of trust and buy-in. So with that gradual shift from proving to improving and using data to optimize your own provision, that's where I think it becomes very powerful. So those are trends that seem to be occurring. So yeah, I'd encourage you to advocate for that. Advocate for data that's useful for you. Do an audit of your data. If you're collecting data and no one else is asking for it and no one's using it, stop it. Don't ask for it anymore. Only collect what you need for your essential accountability purposes, but principally to guide your improvement efforts.
Hi, I'm Graham, speaking from Better Place. Just a question which is sort of in parallel, which is that what about when data is used perhaps for more sinister purposes, such as we could reflect upon robo-debt, in terms of propensities and punishment rather than inducements for behavioural change?
Yeah, so absolutely, data can be used for good, but data can be used for evil, for sure. And there are lots of examples of similar practices in the UK. We saw the rise of what was referred to as new public management, where, again, it comes back to this point about accountability. I think if the function and the purpose of data is purely accountability focused, it will get manipulated, used, and misused. And I think there are steps that you can do to mitigate against that gaming. I think a lot of that comes back to pushing back and just not collecting what is not required. But again, I think the growing emphasis on data for learning and improvement as opposed to accountability is the way to ward against evil. Yeah.
Hello, my name's Claire Torellia from Catholic Care Sandhurst in Victoria. I was interested in hearing about your statistics around children with high needs and the services provided for them and the mismatch between the two. And I was wondering if your research had extended to some of the Nordic countries that seem to have found evidence-based responses to needs of families, and whether there's a discrepancy there and a learning for us in non-Nordic countries in relation to that. So
we haven't replicated the work directly in any Nordic countries, but I think there's a really there's a really interesting story that emerged from the Nordic responses to similar levels of need. And also we gathered some similar data in a number of jurisdictions in the UK as well. And I think Michael referred to this earlier today as well, the services that we provide to children and families are really important, but they're only part of the response. Services can never be the answer. Services responding to established problems can never be the whole answer. We're purely being responsive and responding and trying to mitigate against a whole bunch of structural drivers of need and inequality that exist. So one response is the policy stuff, the advocacy, the movement building to challenge and dismantle some of those structures that are driving inequalities and so on. Services, of course, have an important buffering role. A middle response that's been emerging that's very interesting is the role of social connection within communities and communities holding and responding to needs themselves. And this was definitely an approach that was taken and supported in the Nordic countries. So one thing that we looked at in these data, I didn't present on it today, but as well as asking about needs, high levels of needs and service provision, we also asked children, families, do you have people in your community that you can turn to? If you had a crisis in the middle of the night, is there someone you can turn to for help? If you needed help, is there someone you can reach out to? Do you have, social connection that you can draw upon? And the good news is that 85% of children and families report saying, yeah, there's someone I can turn to. And that's an asset. That's a huge asset. Your services can reach maybe 12%. But 85% of the population have got people within their community that they can turn to. What, of course, we don't know is whether those supports are helpful, whether they're perhaps benign or they might be unhelpful. And I'm sure we probably all reflect on helpful, benign, and unhelpful responses from family, friends, and people in our communities. But nonetheless, that represents a real critical opportunity to build upon. So I think that some of the learning for the Nordic countries is, yes, invest in services and get them right, but also invest in building on the capabilities and assets that exist within the social fabric of your communities and help communities hold need and risk. And that can be one way of tackling it. The really scary thing about when we looked at that data as well, though, is it started getting a bit crazy. We were overlapping like so many circles now. So, but there was one segment of the population that had high levels of need. So they're in that pink circle. They weren't receiving services, and they also didn't have social connection. And that represented 5% of the whole population. And if there's any subgroup in the population, they're the ones that keep me awake at night. Those are vulnerable children, families who are not in contact with services, and they don't have social connections. So if services are going to target anyway, you should really reaching out to those. So bolster social assets that exist within your communities as one strategy, and segment your services to those that are really out and vulnerable.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking Tim for his presentation. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much. Cheers.